Okay, so I think we can move on to the next agenda item, and that would be data perspectives.
Sure. So you are going to hear from Chris Brown and from Dr. Simon today, the first of a series of data presentations. So different than in years past where you have had 100-slide presentation all at once with test data and other aspects of our data. Chris Brown and his team are preparing over a series of time to provide you a series of data presentations. And then today, he and Dr. Simon are also going to take some time to speak to social emotional learning data and how we are going to be assessing that and activating on that differently as we open school this year.
Thank you. Good afternoon. End of the day, after lunch, real dense data presentation. I will try and stay as engaging and energetic as I can for everybody so that we can get into this. Make sure you have your caffeine ready. Like Dr. Baker said, I try and look for silver linings and everything. And the redirected learning in the spring actually caused us to have a kind of a hole in the traditional mountains of data that we collect. So it allowed us to think about, if we aren't reporting on the data we've always reported on, since we don't have it, what else could we do? And my team really thought hard about doing some research around some of the data we always talk about to make sure that we understand it the way we think we understand it. So instead of presenting a huge mountain of data, which often I get reported back to from principals as very overwhelming, we wanted to really dive into some smaller subgroups and think about, are we creating interventions that are meeting the needs, and are we actually creating interventions that match what the data really tells us when you dig into it? So today I'm going to talk specifically about African American population, and then in upcoming board meetings I'll talk about Latinx students, I'll talk about special ed students, homeless foster youth, and we'll kind of go through each of the groups independently because their needs are not all the same, so we shouldn't necessarily talk about them as if their needs are all the same as we go through. So just kind of a starting position so that you know where we're at. These are our CalPADS numbers for the fall in terms of our district demographics. Our percentages are relatively static in terms of what they've been over the past few years. We're just over 70,000 students. We're 8,500 or so African American, 8,500 or so white, about 41,000 Hispanic students, and then 12,000 students that select something else when they indicate their ethnicity. So Long Beach has done a lot of work over the past decade. And compared to other districts and compared to other areas of state, we've seen some massive growth, and we have some areas to continue to grow. So I'm going to start with some of the areas where we've really seen some good things happening as a way of jumping off into some of the areas where we really have to focus and get to the root cause of what we're seeing. So I'm going to talk about gaps for a few minutes because that's what everyone's talking about. That's what's in the media. That's what we're all hearing about, is what are the gaps between our groups. So I'm not going to show you every culture and climate metric, but I picked one that's relatively representative of what's happened since 2015 through 2019. And this data we actually do have because we gave the survey in February before redirected learning. So one of the questions we often ask our secondary students is about fairness and respect between teachers and knowledge of the rules. And in 2015, our response rates were, favorable. White students were favorably responding about 63% of the time. African Americans is 56, and the district was 62. Over the last 5 years, we've reduced that gap, and everybody has improved. So every single student, or every single group of students, has reported more favorably to knowledge and fairness of rules, respect between them and teachers, things like that. And that's really, I think, a direct result of the U6 work we've been doing system-wide. Everybody's been trying to work with our students, really be clear about the rules, really get to know our students and build relationships, and you see that. And now the gap, given our statistical pieces, is really not statistically significant. You get a very small gap now as compared to 5 years ago. That's to be celebrated, and our teachers have done a lot of work to make that happen. AP enrollment. We know we've focused on AP access over the past few years, and we've increased it. And we've increased it for everybody. And we've closed the gap between groups a little bit, right? So we're seeing a lot more students in AP classes. We're seeing a lot more students from all of our subgroups in AP classes. The gap has gone down. There is still a gap, and we still need to attend to that. But we are seeing some progress there in that's that area of excellence. We talk a lot about graduation. I'm a high school guy, so high school's kind of going to dominate this a little bit. Sorry, elementary and middle school. It's just sort of a holdover from the last few months. But we talk about graduation, right? They spend 12 years with us, And then they finish and they go out into the world, and in 2010, the graduation rate was 86% for white students, it was 78% for the district overall, and it was 76% for African American students. 2019, it was 90% for white, 86% for African American, and 85% overall. We've done a lot of work to close that gap. We're graduating a lot more students than we used to, and we're graduating a greater percentage of them. We are seeing similar gap closures in certain metrics in elementary and middle school, right? So grades 3 through 5, prior to the COVID year, so again, this is going back a little bit, the gap closure for ELA performance was there. It's not a huge gap closure, but all of our students are progressing. This is the way we like to see gap closures, by the way. Everybody going up to narrow the gap, right? And the groups that are struggling going up the most. And we see similar trends in math over the past few years. So there are some things to be celebrated. One of my favorites, we talk about DF rate all the time, right? Because we know that DF rate impacts students' ability to have options post-secondary when they graduate. Here's our percentage of students with below a 2.0 over the past few years. So historically, 2014-15, 37% of our African American students had below 2.0. Now it's 27% of our African American students have below a 2.0. It was 17% for our white students, it was now 9%. And the district overall has also dropped 6%. So more of our students are achieving at a higher level than they used to. This is all great, and this is really due to the work we've done as a system and the work that our teachers have done to get to know their students and to work with their students when they're failing, to design interventions and to provide supports. So we have a lot of highlights. We have a lot of things to talk about in excellence. But we need to talk about some focus areas, because not everything is where we want it to be. Our expectations as a system are much higher than the numbers you're seeing there, right? Gap closure is good, but 2% gap closure can be better, and we can do more. So we have a ton of metrics. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to go through some pieces that our system's going to need to attend to. So middle school, ELA and math. Again, middle school ELA, everyone's gone up. But interestingly, our top performing students as subgroups have gone up more than our bottom performing subgroups. So while everyone's going up, not everyone's going up at the same rate. Not everyone's improving at the same rate. So we need to attend to that. The gap has actually grown a little bit for those students. Oops, sorry. Same with math. Everybody's increasing. We have a higher percentage of our students who are achieving or meeting or exceeding standards in math every year, but that is not proportionally relative, right? So our lower achieving students by subgroup are increasing, but they're increasing slower. So good, but we can be great. And then we're going to talk about some metrics that I'll dig into more in a minute, but one of the things we look at is who's in middle school math accelerated, and I'll dig into this more in a few minutes. But getting into Math 6 accelerated is an indicator of getting into algebra. And algebra in 8th grade has implications for how you qualify into pathways for high school A through G rate, high school grad rate, all of those other things. So getting into Math 6 accelerated or being in accelerated math in middle school is a big thing we need to look for. And we've seen an increase in all of our students who are qualifying for Math 6 accelerated or Math accelerated in general. And that's great, but the gap has also increased by 10%, right? So our highest achieving subgroup has gone up more than our lowest achieving subgroup. Again, everyone's going up, but not at the same rate. PSAT is another thing we give in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade. So it gives us a lot of longitudinal data. It's a good way to track our students over time. And I picked grade 9 and grade 11 here because they're representative of what's happening, and because grade 9 is really given in October of 9th grade. So it's really not a representation of what's happening in high school. They've only been in high school about 6 weeks when they take that test. It's really a representation of their middle school growth. And grade 11, they take in October of the 11th grade year. They've been in high school for 2.5 years, a little less. And so that's the high school PSAT. So again, in middle school, we're seeing slight increases for everybody, but the gap has grown. Now, the gap has gone down in high school, but I would argue that that's probably not the way we want to see the gap go down, with all of our groups decreasing in scores and our top groups just decreasing faster. So in a lot of the things I've shown you, the top group is increasing faster than the bottom group in terms of achievement, and in this particular instance, the top group is actually decreasing faster to close the gap. So while we could show gap closure, it would be a misleading piece of data. And I show you these more traditional data metrics to tell you there's a lot of ways we can look at this, but as we get deeper into the next section, I'm going to show you that when you just take a snapshot like this, it's kind of misleading and it can lead to some erroneous assumptions about what is or is not impacting students. And so my goal for this year is to really show you guys research and correlations and data in a different way so that you don't just see a snapshot as a picture and think, oh, that tells me everything I need to know about what's happening. These groups of students need some more support, these groups need less, these groups are achieving, these groups aren't. Because it's not necessarily clean when you take 7,000 to 12,000 students and clump them together to get these kind of metrics. So all of these metrics were built using 2 full cohorts of kids. If I had used 1 cohort of kids, it would have looked a little different. If I had used 1 grade level snapshot, it would look different still, right? So I share this to share with you that sometimes we show these things, but they don't tell the whole story.
Chris?
Yes, sir.
We're seeing our GPA go up, but our PSAT scores go down. What's up?
That is a great question to which I don't have a great answer. It makes me think about student incentive for taking PSAT, right, in 11th grade. Student motivation around taking SAT or PSAT in 11th grade when they've already taken it in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. And for our 11th grade students, most of them took the exact same exam in 10th grade. So I think there's some pieces there. I think there's also pieces around remembering that GPA was measured middle and high school, whereas that PSAT is only a high school metric, right? So I could separate GPA for you in the future and show you what it looks like in middle school separately than high school or grade by grade. That metric for GPA was just a conglomeration of middle and high school students for whom we have GPA. So what happens is the broader you get, the more the metrics start to level out or actually look better.
Thank you.
Chris,
Yep.
I would also suggest that because we implemented our scale grading policy change, that moving forward, may give us a different perspective on how to also interpret the GPA, correct?
Absolutely. So teachers who are using scale grading, definitely their number of students passing those classes with a D or better and C or better is higher than teachers who are not using scale grading. And we know that there is some grading training we need to do. One of the things that we often talk about is the fact that most of our teachers have never really been fundamentally trained in grading processes. It doesn't happen before they come to us. And so it's something that if we want to be very consistent, we're going to have to design some training for around what does it mean to grade, what's the purpose of grading. There's often a disconnect between grading and outcome on tests, especially to your point, Mr. Meyer, in high school. There's often a disconnect between student SBAC scores and their grades and GPAs. I think part of it too, in having spoken to students when I was a principal, was they care very much about their grades, and they often, depending on what their plans are or what they see as the relevance of the test to them, care less about the test because they see the direct impact of grades on their next course, on their college aspirations, on their A through G rate, things like that. Another thing that we've talked about is AP. And there's no doubt that we've done amazing work opening access to AP. We've been leveled off at around 14,000, just under 14,000 AP exams given every year. And while leveling off might not seem great, it is great if you consider we've had declining enrollment. So we have less and less students and still have the same number of AP tests given, which is substantially more than it was given 5 years ago. So we have far more students taking AP. The pass rates have gone down a little bit. So as we start thinking about what do we need to do as a system, we need to start focusing on AP supports to go along with that increased access that we've created, right? We created the access, now we've got to create the supports and interventions to support our students being successful in those AP. One of the, I think, bigger metrics that we talk about a lot is A through G rate. And our A through G rate is really, really strong. Make no mistake, these are fabulous numbers when you think about what other systems are accomplishing and what we're accomplishing here in Long Beach. And we've seen substantial increases in A through G rate for all of our subgroups over the course of the last few years. But again, it's one of those things where the gap's only closed 2%. So we're making strides and we're doing good work, but we need to think about how do we get to that next level. And so in these next few slides, I'll give you some thought processes around that. And then one of the other things you heard Dr. Simon talk about this morning was, or someone talk about, Dr. Simon in the org chart discussion would be really interrogating the overrepresentation of African American students in special ed. So before she gets to that, I wanted to show you exactly what that looks like currently in our system. So in our system, Hispanic students represent about 58% of our system. They represent about 58% of our special ed students. African American students are 12% of our system, but they're 17% of our special ed students. So that's that overrepresentation that we're looking at, that Dr. Simon is really going to work to interrogate, and we're going to work together on looking at the data and then trying to get to the root cause of that. So my staff looked at that and they said, let's dig in a little deeper. Let's ask another question. Is it that way for all types of special education? Turns out it's not. So again, African Americans represent 12% of our student population. They're 34% of our emotionally disturbed students, right? So it's not even equally based across special ed. So this is that kind of thing that we're talking about, where you can show this picture and they're overrepresented in special ed, and you might lead you to create an intervention or ask some questions or make a plan. But if you didn't realize that it's predominantly focused in the ED classrooms, then you might miss another layer of being able to support those students, being able to support at the earlier level where those placements are happening. So I'm going to close this traditional section with two metrics that we talk about all the time, and we've heard them in actually some of our more recent board meetings. We've heard about these metrics, right? The suspension rate and attendance rate of our African American students. Suspension rate for African American students has actually been falling over the past few years, and the gap has been closing. So I put this in here because I'm going to dig into this in a few minutes and talk about what are the traditional assumptions around suspension rate versus what are the actual impacts that suspension rate is having on our students, and what does that mean for our interventions. But just so we have a background, here's our African American suspension rate. It currently sits at about 6%, down from 11 over the past few years. Now we do have that peak. You'll notice that peak happened for all groups. That happened when we had to change the way that we collected and reported suspensions to the state. When the definition of a suspension changed, that peak happened for everybody. And then we've since come back down from that peak. So when you see a trend in the data where everyone goes the same way, it's usually state changing something. The other one we talk about is chronic absenteeism. And here's the chronic absenteeism for the district. Again, the peak is we had to change the way we reported attendance. This one's not gone the direction we'd like to see, right? We have a huge gap between our most attending subgroup and our African American students. African American students' chronic absenteeism rate sits at about almost 19%. And when you look at this, it's really easy to go, okay, well, as a principal, I'm going to design an intervention. I'm going to find all of my chronically absent African American students. I'm going to put them in an intervention group. We're going to do home visits. We're going to reach out to their families, and that's great. But there's other bands of attendance. The All-In program has multiple attendance bands. And the question I started to ask with my staff was, is this true for everybody? Or are certain types of attendance bands more impactful on student outcomes? Is there an area we want to focus on with these interventions rather than just saying every kid that's chronically absent gets an intervention? So these are the kind of questions we started asking. And so I'm going to talk a little bit over the next few minutes about the relationship between suspension, attendance, and outcomes. And I picked three very specific outcomes because those are the three that really impact students as they transition between elementary and middle, and between middle and high, and then between high school and their post-secondary options. So those are Math 6 accelerated placement. We really know that Math 6 Excel placement has a lot to do with students' elementary school progress. The other one is high school readiness. We give kids a high school readiness index that really helps them in terms of being prepared to move on, be successful in high school, right? And it has attendance, it has suspension, it has GPA, accelerated class placements, all of those types of things in it. And the last one are grad rate and A through G, right? Grad rate, are you ready to get to post-secondary? And A through G, do you have the options that we say we want for you, college and career? Are you able to go into whatever option you choose as a student? And A through G is our real strongest metric of that. So we're going to talk about how these things go together. So I'm not going to talk about just discipline or just attendance. I'm going to talk about the impact of discipline and attendance on kids' metrics in these areas. So when we talk about attendance, the attendance bands for all in, we've got severely chronic. So those are students who are at school 80% of time or less. We've got moderately chronic, so 80 to 89% attendance. At-risk chronic is 90 to 92. It's actually 90 to 92, 99. And then satisfactory is 93 and up. So we've got and then strong attendance, which you can't see because, I apologize, in the conversion from Google Slides to PowerPoint, it slid off the white box, and it's written in the exact color of the background. But strong attendance is 96% to 99%, and then perfect attendance is obviously above that. So let's talk a little bit about elementary school. So I'm going to kind of follow a group of students. We're going to look at them, how they do in elementary, and then middle, and then high school. And for all this data, we did a 2-year cohort. So we looked at the previous 2 5th grade transitioning classes, then the previous 2 8th grade transitioning classes, and then the previous 2 graduating classes, and we combined those pieces of data to paint a picture of what's going on. And really the question is to help us get to some root causes, like why do we see these things that we see? So here are the attendance bands. So it's not just about chronically absent. You'll see that a lot of our African American students actually exist in that at-risk group, right? They're not chronically absent. They're on campus 90% of the time or more, but it's still a big group of those students. So while their chronic absenteeism, in this case in elementary, is about 14%, and you could say there's 14%, I would argue with you that there's another 14% of kids that are right there on the cusp. And we've got to make sure we're taking those kids into account because they could easily be chronically absent, but they're not. They're here 90%, it means they're getting there as much as they possibly can. What are we doing with those kids? So we have to know where our students are falling these bands. Suspension rate, it's the same story really in all 3 grades, and we'll go through it, but our African American students are about twice as likely to be suspended once or more, and almost 3 times as likely to be suspended 2 or more times during their time in elementary school from TK through 5th grade. So we have that piece of information, but it's interesting to look at how it impacts things. So we'll take a minute to describe what you're seeing here. So we're looking at students in each attendance band. So students who had strong attendance, satisfactory, at risk, moderately chronic, or severely chronic, and what was their placement in Math 6 Accelerated, right? So we can see at the top, for all of our non-African American students, 77% of non-African American students who are strong attendance students get into Math 6 Accelerated. For African American students, it's 62%. So these are the kids with the same attendance patterns, so the difference isn't attendance. And in fact, when you look down the list, what you find is that for kids who show up to school 90% of the time or more, kids who are on campus, that's where the biggest gap is between our African American students and our non-African American students. Once you get to the kids who are not on campus, kids who are chronic or severely chronically absent, the gap is really not there. Now, don't get me wrong, those numbers are not great, and those math placements aren't fabulous, but it tends to be impacting everybody at a much more similar level. So if you're designing an intervention for math and you're focusing on your chronically absent kids, that's actually not the students that you're going to get the biggest impact with. It makes you think about, well, maybe actually the biggest gap is in my students who are here 90 to 93% of the time. So I want to create an intervention for my students who are here most of the time. They're here, I can get them, they're coming to school, and that's where the biggest gap is between non-African American students and African American students. So that's where we need to intervene. So we want to start asking these correlation questions. Yes?
Quick question. Is it possible to disaggregate the African American special ed subgroup to look at their, since they're overrepresented in special education, to look at their absenteeism?
It is. I did not for this report, but I can in the future. I will make that note.
Okay. Thank you.
Just give me 1 second to write that down. Sorry.
And I'm just thinking, as you're referencing overrepresentation and under-representation, that since they are overrepresented students with disabilities, it'd be interesting to look at their absentee rate. Well,
and that's a great point, that overrepresentation, because the other point I'm going to make to you is being at risk of chronic absenteeism, so being in the bottom of the 90% absenteeism, has the biggest impact on our African American students. And if you go back, they're more likely to be in that group. There's more of them in that band of attendance. So not only is it a band of attendance that impacts their Math 6 placement, there's more of them as a population in that group than there is of our non-African American students. So the impact is actually magnified because they're overrepresented in that band of attendance, and that band of attendance tends to have a more deleterious effect on their success.
Absolutely, Chris. And then to add to that, then we could also disaggregate the suspension rate of those special education chronically absentee African American students.
We can, and we haven't, and we're working on it. The other thing we asked after we put the slideshow together was how many of these absences are due to suspension days, right? So how many of them have their attendance band changed because of suspensions, right? So where's the nexus between suspension and attendance? And we're working on that currently.
Yeah, not
Thank
just
you,
the
Chris.
African American student, but any other subgroup, special
Yep.
subgroup that's represented in that population.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're going to do the exact same demonstration for all of our subgroup populations as I come through over the next few board meetings. So we just started here, but we're definitely doing the same thing for our Latinx population, for our special ed population, for our homeless foster population, for all of our subpopulations.
Yeah, and I know it's not just the African American student subgroups that we're talking about, but I want to understand the dynamic for all the other special populations as well.
Yep, absolutely. And when we get a little farther, you'll see that there's some things that we always assumed had impacts that actually impact certain populations less than others.
Right.
So continuing forward, we can talk about suspension rate, so same idea. So what you have is students with no suspensions, one or more, or two or more suspensions, and you see a similar pattern, right? So of students who aren't suspended, 73% into Math 6 accelerated for non-African Americans, and then 56 for African Americans. And the gap actually decreases as you end up getting suspended. So there's still a gap there, but it shrinks as you go down. So 2 or more suspensions, the impact starts to look more the same, whether you are an African American student or not. It has a huge impact on your ability to get a Math 6 accelerated, which really speaks to that idea of we need restorative justice practices and things like that to support our students before they get suspended. All of our students, because suspensions hurt all of their chances to get into Math 6 accelerated in elementary school. So it's really a negative impact for all of our kids. And then the last thing we looked at was, what if you have both? So what if you are chronically absent and you've been suspended? What's the impact then on your Math 6 placement? So at the top, again, you see students who have not been suspended ever and are not chronically absent or at risk. And you see the gap in placements. If they have either chronic absent or a suspension on their record. And then the bottom is they have both. So they are both chronically absent and have been suspended. And we'll come back to this in a minute. I want you to remember this. So this is the way it looks for elementary kids moving into middle school. You're going to see this pattern shift as we move up the grades. It's very interesting, and it has very big ramifications for how we design interventions for our students. But this is for kids who are both, because we looked at, what if you have both of these things? And the reality is, if you have both bad attendance or poor attendance and have been suspended, then you're going to be, no matter what kind of student you are, you're going to be really hard pressed to get into Math 6 accelerated. So we have to intervene to keep our kids on campus, whether they're not coming from some reason they can't control or we're sending them home. We have to keep them on campus. So we're going to go through the exact same things in middle school, so hopefully it'll go just a slight bit quicker, because I did the same thing for middle school so that you could see. But remember, the output is not Math 6 accelerated anymore, now it's high school readiness. Here's your attendance bands in middle school. You'll see that the gap tends to grow a little bit in terms of, or stay about the same, I should say, in terms of attendance and where our students are falling in their attendance bands in terms of chronically at risk, or severely chronic, and at risk. So once again, our African American students are overrepresented in our at-risk, chronic, and severely chronic groups. The suspension rate data, so 11% of non-African American students have been suspended 1 or more times, and 24% of African American students, and then it's 4% and 11% for 2 or more suspensions. So we look at attendance on high school readiness, and we find a very similar thing, only with high school readiness, you have a big gap at strong attendance, and then the gap kind of shrinks a little bit. And that's interesting, because those are the kids who are there almost all the time. Those are kids through school. So I think the assumption is often, well, we can't get them high school ready because they're not here. That's actually not true. It's the students who are there that we're struggling to get high school ready. So that changes how we want to sort of intervene and design plans to meet the needs. Those are kids who are on campus. We got to get them ready. That's on us. They're not missing because of some other reason. So remember I told you the pattern would start to flip on some things? So here you go. So here's suspensions. So students who have no suspensions in terms of high school readiness in middle school, 72% of non-African Americans are high school ready and 60% of African Americans. As you move down, it turns out that suspensions actually have a much greater impact in middle school on your non-African American students than they do on your African American students in terms of readiness. Now, they are negatively impacting everybody. So there is no good suspension data. But the reality is they're far more impactful on our non-African American subgroups. So as we dig into those other subgroups, maybe they're homeless foster, special ed, Latinx, et cetera, we'll find out which group is getting hit the hardest by that as we look across, because it's not what we thought. And I think that's often the assumption we hear about suspension rate is that it's going to look the way it looked in elementary, and it doesn't. And then we did the both. And so this is that other part of that pattern reversing. So for students who have neither been suspended nor are chronically absent, there's about a 9% gap in high school readiness between our African American students and our non-African American students, which is a closure from previous years. So that is positive news. And actually, as you move down, if you are both chronically absent and suspended, our African American students outperform our non-African American students in that subgroup for being high school ready. So you see that the impact is not always what we assumed. And then for high school, interestingly, for high school, the attendance bands are very similar between African American and non-African American students. They look very different than they do in elementary and middle. So in elementary and middle school, there's a big gap in the attendance bands, and in high school, there's not that big a gap in attendance bands. And turns out a lot of kids are, 20% of kids in high school, of all students in high school, are at risk for poor attendance, right? So it means when we start creating interventions for high school students for attendance, it's for all of them, right, for 20%, not for necessarily one subgroup over the other. The suspension rate data stays about the same. The one or more suspensions, it's about double, and for the two or more suspensions, it's 3 to 5 times more, depending on elementary, middle, or high school. We are aware of that. We know that we have to make an intervention on that as a system. We have to fix that. But when you start looking at the impact, it starts to look a little different. So when we look at the impact of attendance on graduation rate, attendance actually has a far greater impact on non-African American students' graduation than on African American students' graduation rates. So when you get down to severely chronic, you're down to a 10% gap. That is, non-African American students are 10% less likely to graduate than our African American students who are severely chronic in attendance, which I think is, that when we did this correlation, this was not what I was expecting to see, to be very frank. And it means that our attendance interventions for our severely chronic kids that have been focused on one subgroup or another need to be rethought a little bit in terms of who they're targeting, right? Who are they putting in those groups to get them there? In fact, other than at strong attendance, where the gap is really not that big, at every subsequent attendance level, our African Americans are out-graduating our non-African American students. And I think that speaks to that slide I showed at the beginning where the grad rate has improved for everybody, but you saw the gap really closed in grad rate, right? Our lowest graduating rate students have come up to be right there with everybody, and really we're graduating all of our students. For A through G, you see a similar pattern. There is a gap, but again, the worse the attendance, the smaller the gap is, right? So it turns out that attendance actually has just a huge impact on A to G, and it has it across subgroups. It's not something that impacts one subgroup more than another. And in high school, African Americans aren't overrepresented in the lower attendance bands either. So this is one of those things that attendance on grad rate and attendance on A through G is not something that's impacting African American students more than it's impacting every other student that we have. It impacts everybody at about the same level. So when we think about global interventions, attendance can be a global intervention at the high school level, whereas at the elementary middle school level, maybe it's not a global intervention, it's a more targeted intervention. Whereas other types of things might be more specific around gatekeeper classes, Algebra 1, et cetera. When you look at suspensions, again, we see that same kind of reversal of fortunes. For graduation rate, no suspensions, pretty good, not much of a gap. 1 or more and 2 or more suspensions, you'll see that our African Americans far overachieve our non-African American students who've been suspended. So being suspended in high school, while it does have an impact on grad rate, it's actually more for our non-African American students than it is for African American students, which is just interesting data. And then same with A through G rate, actually. We know that students who are suspended, it really lowers their A through G completion ability. but it lowers everybody's A through G. So again, it speaks to that need to have suspension interventions in high school that are universal, that target all of our students, because when we suspend a student in high school, regardless of what subgroup they fall into, it negatively impacts their outcomes at about the same rate. And then if you do the two together, you see the same type of thing, which is not really shocking given the two previous slides. So students who have both chronic and have been suspended, our African American students are actually more likely to graduate than non-African American students who fall into that category, and they're more likely to be A through G. Now, I will point out, only 5 to 7% of our students who have poor attendance and suspensions are likely to be A through G, which means as a freshman, if you identify a student who's there less than 90% of the time, has been suspended once, they're 95% not likely to get A through G. But you have 3 years to fix it. We could intervene right there as a freshman and actually make a huge change in this data, right? Because we know that that is going to impact all of our students in a negative way. So we started looking at correlations, and really the attendance and grad rate and suspension is not new data. It's not all that crazy, but we really want to think about how can we start disaggregating by grade level. So when we looked at attendance, was there one grade level where students fell off attendance? That's what we're going to start digging into. Was there one grade level where suspensions really had a major impact that we need to intervene on? Was there one class that really brought down their A through G? So when you look at A through G, is it Algebra 2? Is it geometry? Is it chemistry? What class is doing that, right? When it looks at Math 6 Accelerated, where do these kids fall off the path for Math 6 Accelerated? So by starting this and by building the processes to do these correlations, we're now able to start disaggregating by grade to try and find the exact moments where these things happen, so we can try and intervene in those grade levels before they happen to reduce the data before we get there. So it's far easier to support a kid who's never been suspended than it is to try and undo a suspension, right? Once the kid's been suspended, they're gone, they've been suspended. And we can get through that and we can be successful, but it'd be better just to not get there. So these are some of our future things. So that's the kind of data I'll be trying to bring you, and I encourage questions. If you have questions for our group of, well, what about this and this? How does this look like on the impact of that? How do special ed attendance look like on Math 6 Accelerated, like you were mentioning earlier? Send them to me. We'll be more than happy to start looking at interesting correlations that are not just here's where we are overall, but you wanted to know a specific grade level, specific subgroups. I wanted to know how Hispanic, male, third graders who've been suspended are faring later. We can start to look at that level of specificity to try and find where to create interventions. So that's what we're looking at, and that's what I want to express to the exec staff and the board is we're trying to get to deeper questioning in the data. So before I move on to the back half, the SEL half, I will stop because that was dense, and I apologize, and I'm 70 slides in 60 minutes. I'm trying to hustle through and open up if there's any questions on the disaggregated data that I showed or any thoughts about moving forward with that kind of data.
I think it's exciting that you've identified the issue of chronic absenteeism and, you know, in conjunction with suspension for 9th graders, because that indicates a 95% chance they're not going to complete their A through G requirements. When you identify something very specific like that, then we can implement interventions so we can catch those kids and get them back on track. So I applaud you for the work you're doing and for the direction that you've taken data, especially in a time when things aren't usual or normal in any way. For you to do something so positive with research, with the numbers, it's a way for us to kind of step back and reflect and say, okay, how are we doing? What can we do differently? So well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would add too that it's tremendous information, Chris. Thinking from the standpoint of a teacher or an administrator at a site, what kind of verities can we draw from this so that we can take the proper intervention? I mean, all this data can be overwhelming, but we need to get down to the very essentials and say point 1, 2, and 3 are top priority for us to address, seems to me.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And one of the things that we're going to start working with our sites on is having them design their interventions that they've always designed, and then we can look at, so what exactly was that intervention designed to do? Let's look at the correlational data and see, did that intervention work? And if not, what do we need to change about it? As opposed to just giving them summary data at the beginning of the year and having them try and dig through it themselves. We're going to try and help them dig through it and ask those specific questions to go, we know this is correlated to that. And so we're going to do more of this or less, depending on the correlation.
We have a question from Dr. Benitez.
Oh, absolutely.
Dr. Williams and I both have that as well.
Well, I think,
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Actually, we
Go
have a
ahead.
question from Dr. Benitez, and then who was next?
Dr. Williams was in,
Okay.
and then
Yep.
I would as well.
Okay, we'll go right down the line. Dr. Benitez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So thank you, Chris. So let me walk through the logic here, because the national research is very clear that targeted interventions and strategies put the biggest dent in our gaps, right? So using that as a rationale, the theory that I'm hearing from you, our theory of change, so to speak, for our district is by disaggregating deeper and more strategically around these indicators by subgroups, in this case, African American subgroups, our district can better develop and or strengthen and expand interventions and strategies that then result in gap reductions, especially for those indicator areas that you've highlighted. I think for me, Chris, the most important feature of that theory of change is differentiating between global interventions and targeted interventions. We see in a lot of the data that you shared, and historically, the data that I've seen for the last 20 years, is that we do make improvements overall in our district, whether that's AP completion rate or graduation rate or other indicators, but where we have the tough time is in the gap, right? So although groups are improving, sometimes the gaps are staying the same. Sometimes they're improving slightly, 2 or 3%. Other times they're actually widening. So the question here, Chris, is what are we doing new or differently now? Because I heard sort of a similar presentation last year and the year before, and I've been sort of tracking how our district has been doing stuff for 10, 15 years. What are we doing differently now that would allow for us to differentiate global interventions versus targeted interventions in those areas that are most critical, right? Namely, our African American chronic absenteeism and African American academic performance. Can you just illustrate for me one thing or one strategy at a certain grade level that then we can build on? Because I think that's the part that community members have a tough time reconciling. I personally, when we go through this data, I see growth, I see improvement, but I don't see sort of that systemic, what are we doing differently or what are we going to do differently with this new data approach that then would result in targeted strategic intervention and would put a dent, a sizable dent in the gap, not the overall improvement, but the gap specifically.
Sure, so that's a great question, and that's exactly the point I was trying to make, right, is that targeted interventions require very specific data. So for example, in the elementary and middle schools, you saw that the biggest group for attendance for our African American subgroup was the at-risk, so the students who were present 90 to 93% of the time. And that also had the biggest impact on their placement in Math 6 Accelerated. So we could actually create a targeted intervention around those students who are there between that 90 to 93% in those schools that have that group as an overrepresented group. So not only targeted by that attendance band, but targeted by site. So one of the things that we're looking to do in research is create these sort of high leverage targets, these high lever pieces that we know have impacts, and then break them down by site, because not every site may be feeling that exact same impact. And so we want to be able to make sure that the sites are intervening where it means the most to them as a site, and other sites might not have that problem and have to intervene somewhere else. So very targeted, not only in terms of the data, but also in terms of site-specific targets. So we're hoping in research we're not just going to give broad swaths of data to our sites, but just give them the pieces that are high lever for them. And I think Dr. Simon has a response as well.
I was going to add to that. Can you guys hear me with this mic? Yes? Okay. So I wanted to add to that. About a year ago, we applied for a grant with the California Department of Education to build attendance tiers and interventions within our system. And so with that grant, we received $1.5 million over the course of 3 years. We were able to hire 2 support staff to help with that work. And we piggybacked off of the Family Resource Center sites because there was already mental health initiatives and incentives that were happening within those sites, especially with 12 dedicated staff who were working with students on social, emotional, and behavioral health we need supports. So with this campaign that's called the All In campaign, we're working in 25 sites that are elementary and middle in our most vulnerable areas, the same schools as our Family Resource Center schools, and we're providing, as you mentioned, Dr. Benitez, those global interventions, right, those tier 1 interventions that are meant for all students, but also targeted interventions based on the tier 2 and tier 3. So based on the indicators that Mr. Chris Brown showed for All In, those indicators were built specifically for All In sites, right, to see there's students who are within those bands, so we can act accordingly. So we're looking at those students who are within those moderate and at-risk bands, and so with that, there's outreach, parent phone calls. If we need to refer that student for social, emotional, or behavioral health-related needs support to the Family Resource Centers, they're receiving those services. If the family just needs basic needs, right, the Maslow before you bloom philosophy, we're referring those families out to those agencies to receive that to get that information. So there's so many things that are compacted into that. And even before COVID, we were doing home visits. We were having deep conversations, meeting families right where they were and where they currently are. And so with COVID, that has changed some of that, but there are very targeted interventions. So even based on all insights, maybe we can do this for the next presentation, we can show how those interventions have decreased the chronic absence rates, the chronic absentee rates at those schools specifically, and not just by small numbers, but by significant numbers, even based on subgroups, which are African Americans, which are foster youth, which are homeless youth, which are students with disabilities. The work has been instrumental. And it's not just a Melissa Espinoza or Lorena Cervantes thing. These are our 2 dedicated counselors who are doing the work. It is also based on the work that our school sites are doing as well, in concert with our principals, in concert with the counselors and school psychs, and all of the support staff they have there to build in those interventions too. So I do want to highlight that because you are going to see some decreases. And then even with that, we know we can't reach all schools based on the grant, but we are supplying all 85 schools with such interventions so they can employ them and employ them on their own as well.
Aaron, we had to still have, excuse me, may I?
Well, actually, we had Dr. Williams
I'm sorry.
waiting,
I'm sorry.
and then Ms. Kerr, sorry.
I'll yield to John. John, I'll go after you. Go ahead.
Well, we used to still have, I hope, Alex Chavez and Cliff Parks, who work for the district. Those 2 great guys used to go out and make home calls in homes where the absentee rate was high. I hope we still have them doing that.
We do, at some capacity.
Do we?
Yeah.
All right. Thank
Aaron,
you.
my
I'm
question.
sorry.
I even go up myself sometimes if I can, and many other staff members do the same thing just to reach and meet our parents where they are. So absolutely, Mr. Meyer.
Based on the information you just provided, I would be interested in looking at that data over time to see the overall impact of that group that you're working with relative to this grant.
Yes, sir.
The other piece of that, Chris, is one, I want to see some of the other subgroups also included in that information. And you know, it's always been an oddity to me that as you begin to close the achievement gap, as you work towards closing the achievement gap, if you're providing quality instruction, everybody improves.
Right.
So when you talk about closing the achievement gap, that almost becomes a misnomer because everybody's improving, unless you hold one group steady so that the other groups can catch up. But again, that's not being fair. So, but I know a few years back when we were looking at suspensions, we did have some targeted processes to deal with, and we knew where those suspensions were coming from. So we could work directly, and I'm sure we can do that today. But the thing is why are we getting this flux back and forth if we understand where those suspensions are coming from?
So that's definitely the next level of disaggregation for me is to break it down by site, right? And look at sites over time to see if as one site implements an intervention and suspensions rate go down, do we see raises or increases in suspension rate at other sites that weren't doing that intervention, those types of things. We just didn't get to that level, but we are going to. And I'll bring that to the board.
And I know we're going long, we'll keep it short. When we talk about the interventions and working with the at-risk and the moderate chronic and the severely chronic, the other side of that for me is that our students who have strong attendance still have in elementary school still have a 15-point gap. So our Black students who are there ready to learn in their class at the same rates as their peers there's still a 15-point gap in placement in math, for example, math, accelerated math in middle school. So why? You know, we go back to that question is what is inherent in our system that we have students sitting in that classroom ready to learn and we still have that gap? And so that goes back to when we talk about the systemic injustices that have persisted over time, that if those kids are sitting side by side in a classroom, what's the difference in that? Is it instruction? What is it? And so I get the intervention side of it, but I also get the flip side of it of when we have our kids there ready to learn, there's still a gap, which means we have other things we need to identify because they're not placed in math, and for example, at the same rate. And what is that about our system if they're all in school trying to learn? So it's just the other side of the question to ask, I think, in addition to the deep interventions.
So this slide deck was originally like 200 slides, but those are definitely the questions that my team are asking, like why, which grade level, which sites?
Right.
So they are running with this data. And again, to your point, Dr. Williams, they're running with all subgroups, not just African American. We just focused on that today. We're going to focus on other subgroups moving forward, but we're doing the same data analysis for all the sites for all the subgroups.
So a couple things I just wanted to call attention to, Dr. Williams. What you described in terms of whole system improvement and then acceleration is another description of excellence. All students improving in a continuously improving organization. And then acceleration is equity. Acceleration is that our lower performing students or our students who have not traditionally performed as well need to accelerate faster then the whole group is going up. And so it's a really important connection back to the way that we're thinking about our work. And then also just, I think just to put a pin on the fact that this isn't just about disaggregation of data. That's an important aspect of really understanding our students. However, this is more precise than that. And so this is next level when I think about the work of Dr. Lund and Dr. Kale passing the baton to Chris Brown. This is next level, and it's seizing a moment in time when we don't have the same kinds of data that we've had in the past to do something different. So beyond disaggregation, this is around correlation. This is around multiple variables. So all the smart minds that work at a school, they're not just doing more, they're getting more precise in what they're able to do because of the data and how it's being correlated. So you might think you at a school, put a lot of energy in chronic absenteeism. That would be a really normal response when you want students to be at school. But then when you look at correlation data and say, really, there's something else here. What else is here? It's not all for us to solve. Part of this is for us to provoke the system and ask our smart teachers, our smart principals, and all of our support staff that work with schools to think about what those solutions are, because there's more to it than we can just solve in this room right now. But good for us, for the next level kind of correlation that allows for precision, targeted, intentional attention where it's most needed. So,
I'll hold my question.
no, go ahead, Dr. Williams.
And I concur wholeheartedly with that. I mean, it's been something I've been looking at for the longest in terms of research. And knowing that, you know, even the grading practices sometimes weigh very heavily against kids of color. The subjective types of grading and as a piece of this whole puzzle. But the bigger piece of this puzzle, as we all know, is race. That's the bigger piece, and how you deal with that in terms of educating people in the classroom and its tremendous impact is a very, very important piece that because you can't legislate behavior.
Right.
You just can't. You got to figure out a way to talk to people so they understand why it's important, what the ramifications are, and what difference it makes if you change your perceptions, your behaviors, and things of that nature. To me, that has always been the driving force behind all of this. But in spite of it, we still have seen progress being made, even though incrementally, we still see progress being made.
Yes, we have a strong foundation
Yeah,
to build
because
on.
you've got a culture that is building and really moving towards making those systemic changes necessary. So, you hold out for that, and I think that what I'm seeing put in place in this district is all moving towards that. And in terms of what you're doing, in terms of what transpired before, there's all been progressions that we're getting to the point where, and we've seen the indicators of that. We also seen some of that flip back and forth over time. And we're not in this alone, as an organization. We still have our partners on the other side over here, where we need their help. We really do need their help because a lot of this is on the other side. When I say other side, I'm talking about in the teaching arena. So we need our partners to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, this is an all of us, absolutely, commitment.
Okay, I'm not into reductionism, but I'm a high school teacher, and I've got 175 students. And I try to love and welcome each one. But I need from the database some concrete clues of what I can do for interventions into the most needy students. Otherwise, this is all electronic buzz.
Yes.
Doesn't mean anything.
That's right, point well taken, and that's where we're heading. It won't be answered today, but that's where we're heading.
Good.
So I'm going to ask our team and Mrs. Craighead to entertain the idea of incorporating the SEL metrics component in tomorrow's presentation. I think it goes with some of what will be presented around curriculum and around opening of school, if that's okay with you.
I think that would be a good idea, to roll it over to tomorrow. In that case, I want to thank everybody for the presentations. It represents a lot of work, and we do appreciate that. I also want to thank our MMS for being able to coordinate a remote member joining us, and presentations and speakers and cameras everywhere and wires. Thank you so much for being able to,
Madam Chair,
handle
if I
our.
may. Chris, thank you. They saved the best for the last today.
Ms. Kerr?
Sure, can I just do a quick announcement?
Yes.
So today is August 18th, 2020, and 100 years ago today, white women, I will specify, were given the right to vote. It has been a long journey. I have my women's suffrage mask if anybody gets close enough to see. Otherwise, I will post a picture. But we know that in addition to the names that we know who worked for women's suffrage, there were African American women like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Church Terrell, Sojourner Truth, and Ida B. Wells, all who played historic roles in that win. And that the reality is, it's been a long campaign for the right to vote. And a range of subsequent laws was required to fully open the ballot access to others, including Black women, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Chinese Americans, and the Korean Americans. Among those necessary laws were the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the adoption of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the 24th Amendment in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. All this to say it is a continuous movement, our right to vote, that is a little bit under threat right now. So I celebrate the 100 years of the 19th Amendment and thank those who have continued to franchise folks across our spectrum and continue to do that work today.
Yeah, just to add, that's a good point, very good point. John, you did say to save the best for last, right? Aaron, you're included in that, right? All right.
That's right.
All right.
Absolutely, Aaron.
Well, thank you all, and we will be adjourned until tomorrow morning at 8:30, where we will reconvene right in this room. Thank you.